Let's talk to Conservative MP Sir Desmond Swayne. He's a former minister who has long campaigned against the lockdown rules. Sir Desmond, I'm sure you were I suppose, bemused as I was on Saturday night and Sunday morning to find all of these people who were absolutely horrified to discover that the laws they had voted for limiting protests were suddenly being enforced by the police.
Well, I've been concerned about this for some time. And I'm surprised at the number of protests against lockdown that have taken place over the last year, which have been roughly policed, and where there have been, measures taken which I believe are unacceptable, which attracted no attention whatsoever in the media. And that's been a matter of concern for me for some time. So in one regard, at least, I'm glad that this has now hit the headlines, and we've seen how the pandemic is being policed in this respect, at least. And I hope that that will spark rather more resistance than we've seen hitherto about the abrogation of our liberties.
And this is the thing, isn't it? A lot of people say it's absolutely outrageous. Of course, people have a right to gather to express their concerns about this case. And you think, well, where were you for the last year? People seem to be very keen to protect the rights of free speech and the rights of protest, but only when it's something they feel strongly about or something they agree with.
Well, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. At least they are protesting now about the diminution of our liberties in the way that they've been taken away. And I can understand their feeling. And I've had a daily, I've just sat and answered over 100 emails this morning from outraged law-abiding people in the New Forest, who are complaining about the scenes that were on their television screens. And yes, they're protesting now about something that they didn't protest about before, but I think that that is at least positive. My concern, however, is that a number of them are now saying, well, will you vote against the police and crime bill tomorrow? And I think that, actually the way that the police proceeded on Saturday night, with a want of judgment. Yes, there were people in that crowd who were there for illegitimate purposes, but the lack of judgment in the policing of it was a gift to them and to anarchists and to the opponents of the police and crime bill, which is a massive measure covering all sorts of different areas, including sentencing, but is designed to protect the public from premeditated unlawful demonstrations, designed to disrupt their enterprise, prevent them going around their lawful business, blocking motorways, airports, and attacking enterprises in the way that we saw from Extinction Rebellion a couple of years ago. And that's a clean different thing.
You still support that bill. You're going to vote for that bill on Tuesday. And
I'm going to vote for that bill on Tuesday.
With the 80 majority, if people like you are voting for it, that will still go through then.
I certainly hope so. I mean, there are areas of it which are matters of legitimate concern with respect to are the powers on policing of demonstrations proportionate, and that can be examined in detail at report and committee. But I would certainly not vote against the principle of such a wide-ranging measure, most of it entirely uncontroversial, most of it which people will be entirely in favour of, tougher sentences for many crimes. So I'm certainly not going to vote against it at second reading.
Good morning to you. This is talkRADIO Breakfast with me, Julia Hartley-Brewer. Delighted to welcome the Crime and Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse, to the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. What went wrong on Saturday night?
Well, obviously, the footage of Saturday night was distressing and alarming to lots of people, not least me, and I know the Home Secretary and Prime Minister. But to understand what the decision-making was and what happened, we've asked for an independent inquiry to deliver in fast time to understand the decision-making taken by the police on the night that resulted in that distressing footage. It's worth reflecting on the fact, though, as you and I have talked about in the past, that over the last 10 or 12 months, the police have been in a difficult position doing a job that we've never asked them to do before in standing between us and a virus, and that all their actions in these situations where mass gatherings, which are illegal, do take place is focused on protecting public health. But we'll get to the bottom of it, and critically, there'll be a transparency about an accountability to the Met, which is what we need most.
Well, this is it. You say the footage was distressing and alarming. Weren't the police simply enforcing the law brought in by your government and voted for by a majority of MPs in Parliament? Why is it distressing and alarming to see police officers enforce the laws that you put in place?
Well, obviously, there is the legislation, and you would expect the police to enforce that. That's quite right. But there are individual decisions about particular policing posture taken on the ground in the moment by ground commanders, which do result sometimes in distressing footage. And where you have a force that polices by consent, as the Met Police and all forces do, it's critical that there is accountability and transparency about that decision making. Now, whatever your view of the footage might be, Julia, it has caused widespread alarm and concern because this was a vigil to commemorate a young woman who was killed in terrible circumstances, and the juxtaposition of that against the footage has caused concern.
Okay, there's no doubt at all, Minister. It was a PR disaster by the Met, but a huge, big male police officers manhandling young women to the ground who were mourning the death of a woman for whom the person who's charged with the murder is a serving police officer. Absolute disaster. However, were you also distressed and alarmed when you saw footage of women and men being manhandled to the ground while they were peacefully protesting the lockdown laws? There have been numerous protests where police have gone in very heavy-handed. Were you not distressed and alarmed by that footage as well? And did you not call an independent inquiry into those decisions on the ground? And if not, why not?
So, Julia, I'm always distressed and alarmed whenever these kind of confrontations, if you like, arise.
I don't remember you coming on my show after any of these, even though you're standing in place. You've chosen to do the media round this morning because of the fallout from this. I don't remember you asking to come on the show to discuss it after lockdown protests when they've been policed in the same way.
Oh, well, I have done a fair amount of media over the last few months, specifically around some of these issues and around coronavirus regulations and laws that have been put in place, and in particular answered questions about dealing with protest. But, our job as a government and the police's job is to be transparent with the public when there are concerns. We have lots of structures around complaints about police and investigations. And in these circumstances, this natural public concern around a really terrible crime and these events does seem to us to require a response that seeks that kind of transparency, and that's what we're trying to put in place.
And obviously, we're not going to try and move ahead of the independent inquiry, but of course, these decisions, after in such circumstances, we know these decisions would have gone all the way to the top level. They weren't made by PCs on the ground. Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Chief, would have been involved, as we know also Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. Now, you, of course, were a very senior advisor on these issues to Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, as he was for 2 terms. If these decisions were made at the very top of the decision-making process, should either of those people's heads roll? Should they leave their jobs?
Well, you understand, Julia, first of all, to say there's obviously a very strong operational independence line between politicians and the police, that our job is to put in place the strategies and the legislation and to say what is important. It's their job to decide in the moment how they do it. And I know that the Commissioner is more than happy to be held to account for the decision making, either of her or indeed of her police officers. And in fact, she's welcomed this inquiry that will have a look at that decision making. As for the mayor and his particular posture, well, you'd have to ask him about that. I can't speak for him.
Okay. Why are protests illegal anyway? Given that we know, the evidence has come from both Sir Chris Whitty and indeed Mark Woolhouse, who's an advisor on stage, that there was no evidence of any spikes whatsoever, any evidence of any cases being transmitted during the Black Lives Matter protests, Extinction Rebellion, lockdown protests, all of the other events, people on Bournemouth Beach, when it's not a protest, they're just going to the beach. We've seen no incidences of transmission of the virus in in outdoor settings. Why is there any law preventing people from enacting protests of any kind, vigils or any public gatherings in outdoor circumstances, given that we know there is no risk there?
Well, it's a question of the type of organization outside. If people are closely packed together, if they
when they're closely packed together, it would appear from the evidence presented by the scientific advisors that there isn't a risk of this virus being transmitted.
Well, I don't know whether the scientific view is changing or not, Julia.
You should look at the science. I'm sorry, you're the Crime and Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse. Shouldn't you know? You're in charge of a policy which stops people from enacting their most basic civil liberties in a free democracy, which is the right to protest. But you don't even know whether the science says that that's needed or not.
No, the science indicates that when you spend a long time or prolonged period in close proximity to somebody,
indoors,
whether it's indoors or indeed outdoors, that there is an increased chance of transmission. And it's not very long ago, Julia, just to be honest with you, that the government was coming under significant criticism for allowing the Cheltenham Festival to go ahead.
Not from me, it wasn't.
I'm
just checking. No, I'm just checking. Sorry. So government policy is made on the basis of if there's a lot of criticism in the media and the public, as opposed to the actual science. Are we following data anymore?
Of course not, but our understanding of the way this virus works has changed very significantly over the last 10 or 12 months, as we've learnt more and more about it.
And we now know that there has been no spike in any cases from people being outdoors. So why is there a ban on public protests outdoors?
So we wanted to make sure that this was the very, very last lockdown. And that means that we needed to have rules that removed any shadow of a doubt that we could get on top of the transmission of this virus. And you only have to look in other parts of Europe, like Italy, where I understand they're contemplating another national lockdown, to realize the problem that we are facing. We cannot really afford, either mentally or indeed financially, to have another lockdown. So we have to make sure that this is the last one.
Minister, with all due respect, Julia, the Prime Minister has not guaranteed that. This is not going to be the last lockdown unless the government decides it's the last lockdown, and the government will not guarantee that.
Because we're driven by the data and the numbers. Now, Julia, during the last 10 or 12 months, right, all sorts of profoundly important human assemblies have been restricted or curtailed, from funerals to gathering for the birth of somebody, or even gathering at the deathbed of a relative. It's been dreadful for everybody. But that's why we're so keen to make sure that this is the last one, and that everybody sticks to the rules, and why mass gatherings have to be deterred if at all possible. Happily, the organisers on the night did cancel on Saturday night. This was not an organised assembly, and we will understand more about police operational decision-making on the night in the time to come.
Minister, whether or not people are having a vigil that's organised or not organised has got nothing whatsoever to do with whether we have a fourth lockdown, because that is a political decision. The science tells us, and we've heard from SAGE members themselves, there is no evidence of outdoor transmission at any of these events.
Well, as I say, I haven't seen that
view. I'll WhatsApp to you afterwards, so you make sure you've got it for your
I have
next
seen
interview.
it in the newspapers, and they, one or two of the scientists recently have said that. But these laws were made some time ago when we put this lockdown in place. We are, though, Julia, we're winning. Right, we're winning.
Are we winning? The vaccine rollout's been fantastic, but are we still winning when a law that was made a year ago at the height of an emergency, a pandemic, without much information, is still on the statute book, still stopping people legally protesting in a safe way, which is our fundamental right in a free democracy? Let me talk to you also about the right.
Also, first of all, just to clarify, Saturday wasn't necessarily a protest. It was meant to be a vigil, and for many hours until the events about which we're going to know more in the weeks to come, people had shown up in a socially distanced way and laid flowers and paid their respects and mourned this awful crime that's happened. So it's not like that activity was being prevented. It's the notion of a mass gathering and where that point changed that we need to understand the decision around.
Let me also ask you, in terms of safety, there's a court case being brought by representatives of the hospitality industry to insist that hospitality, pubs, bars, restaurants are reopened alongside non-essential retail on the 12th of April instead of waiting another 5 weeks. They said there's simply no evidence that's been presented that bars and restaurants are any less safe than non-essential shops. Is the government willing to look at this even before the court case is decided?
Well, as I say, the government is constantly reviewing the measures that it takes to fight coronavirus. But the Prime Minister has laid out a strategy for us now to get back to some kind of normality by June the 21st. As I said to you before, we are winning. The vaccine is rolling out. I'm hoping to get jabbed myself in the next couple of weeks. And the numbers are dropping, but we still have 8,000 odd people in hospital. People are still dying from this thing. And if you look at Italy, countries are still going into lockdown. So we have to be on our guard. And while I understand people's natural desire to get back to normal, to go to the pub and to socialize and all this, now is the moment to press home our advantage and make sure we get to June the 21st in one piece.
Does that mean that we can't have pubs and restaurants open and we can't go on protest, though? The point is that it's the idea that these things are all massively linked to each other. If the evidence is that people are not getting COVID and passing it on in these circumstances, then that doesn't make a blind bit of difference to whether or not we pass on the virus.
Well, look, as I say, the Prime Minister said that there's no intention to change the roadmap at the moment. We are constantly driven by the data and the numbers. We have to have a...
Data, not dates, but you won't change the dates if the data changes. Do you see how ridiculous that is?
No, it's not, Julia. Because
how is that not? Explain to me how that's not ridiculous.
Because you need a period. When you make a change, you need a period of time to assess what the impact is on the numbers of infection. And as we go back to school, as we go back on the 29th to rule of 6 outdoors, as we start to get our hair cut from April the 12th, right? We need a period of time after each of these things to see the impact of the de-restriction on what the pattern of the infection is. Okay. Now, all of us, I share your aspiration. I want to get back to normal. It's been incredibly difficult for everybody and damaging for everybody. And I want to get on with fighting crime instead of coming on and talking to you about COVID. So please be assured that we want to get there as fast as we possibly can, but to make sure that this is absolutely the last lockdown. We can't go through this again.
We can't, but it'll be a government decision to do so. I will never, ever accept government ministers saying we have to make sure of that. That is a decision you, as an MP and prime ministers and cabinet members get to take. That is not something that is forced on you. Don't pretend that's not within your choice and your ability to choose that. Sarah Jones joins us now. She's a Labour MP and Shadow Policing Minister. Good morning to you, Sarah.
Morning.
Morning. Thanks for joining us. What do you think went wrong on Saturday night and what needs to be done about it?
Well, I've been speaking to police over the last few days, of course, in my role, and I've also spoken to some of the women that tried to organise the vigil. And I think there were a number of things that went wrong leading up to Saturday night. First was that the initial response from the local police was that there could be some kind of demonstration and some kind of vigil, and they were talking about what that could look like, and the message changed partway through. There then was a court process, and the legal decision was that this wouldn't be illegal if the police and the organisers could come to some kind of agreement. And I think most of us really wished that could have happened, and it didn't. And then I think the question that we don't know the answer to is what happened between the afternoon when Kate Middleton was there and people were paying their respects, and the evening when clearly something went wrong. And we don't know what decisions were made at that point to lead to that, which is why it's right that there's an inquiry into this, because we don't know the answers. And as Cressida said, I don't want to be an armchair critic against the police when we know they have an incredibly difficult job.
Well, this is it. And again, with lots of criticism of the individual police officers on duty, and at any time, each police officer can operate with their own discretion. But at the end of the day, the decision for the police to start arresting young women peacefully, you can either call it a vigil, mourning, protesting, whatever it is they were doing, it was peaceful at the time. And for police to go in a heavy-handed way has raised some concern. We know that, ultimately a decision about this, given the delicacies surrounding the Sarah Everard case, the fact that it is a serving police officer who has been charged with her murder, of course, not gone to trial. We don't in any way affect that judicial process. But there were, of course, obviously going to be concerns about this, with women wanting to make their feelings known. So we know this would have gone all the way up to Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Chief. We also know that Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, was involved in this. Do they have responsibility for what went wrong on the night?
Well, Sadiq Khan has said that he'd received assurances that the policing would be, considerate of the event that we assumed would take place, even though the agreement hadn't been reached. And of course, the organisers, encouraged everyone not to go. I think we need to answer some questions about those policing decisions. Obviously, it was for Cressida, you're right, to make those operational decisions. But I think it does speak to a bigger issue, doesn't it, as well, about protest and what has happened during this COVID period, how difficult the job has been actually for the police to try and navigate their way through this very strange legislation. And there are elements of the bill we're debating today which look at protest, and we're saying let's pause.
Well, hold on. I mean, you, like everyone else I've spoken today, seems to be incredibly bothered about how difficulty the police have in enforcing a law that, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, you voted for. You voted for emergency legislation that is still in place right now, and for its extension, even though where we are in terms of COVID, for the right of protest to be curtailed and for police to be able to use these powers. Why does it bother you that police are using the powers that you yourself put in place?
I'm not arguing that these powers aren't extraordinary, and that's why we need to make sure that when we come out of this, we're not putting those kind of powers into law for the future, because what happened on Saturday needs to be a one-off, not something that becomes...
But it wasn't a one-off. This has happened repeatedly during protests against lockdown. Women thrown to the ground, aggressively handcuffed, men as well, during lockdown, a perfectly peaceful lockdown protest. Did you speak up then?
Well, we've said all along that we think there have been difficulties with the way this has been implemented on some occasions. In the main, I happen to believe that the police have got most of these judgments right. I think something went wrong on Saturday and we need to get answers to it. But we have to keep at the heart of this. And I think it's important to have this debate, but at the heart of all of this over the last week and Sarah Everard's death is the importance to tackle violence against women and the awful record that there is in terms of rape charges, domestic abuse charges, lack of refuges, all those issues that mean that women don't get justice and don't feel safe, and that's what we need to focus on. Absolutely,
women. Not all women don't get justice. Not all women don't feel safe. I don't think we should always speak as if all women have exactly the same experience.
Well, I think the awful death of Sarah clearly ignited something in a lot of women. I'm sure not all, but in a lot of women, including me, of knowing that feeling of making decisions about where you walk home because you don't feel safe. And I think we have all experienced, I would say, some degree of harassment of some kind in public places from men. I certainly have on many occasions over my very long life. None of them things I've ever gone to the police over, but things that actually, and I know this is really hard, but things that actually I think when it comes to things like harassment laws, we should be introducing these things to say this is not kind, this is not normal, this is not acceptable, and this is how we expect people to behave, not making women feel scared.
Okay, but again, there's a very big difference between enforcing the laws that we actually have in terms of like women being killed at the hands of men with whom they're in relationships. And we know that invariably when women are killed, there's been plenty of warning signs. Women and their families have been demanding help, and actually the law isn't actually enforced properly. We don't need new laws. We need them to be enforced by the courts and by the police. But also, there's a difference difference between women being raped and murdered and physically harassed and someone wolf whistling. And a lot of people, Frank, as much as I look, when it did used to happen to me, I always complained about it to the person who did it on the basis I don't, who the hell do you think you are making a comment on what I look like in the street? I don't know you. But the point is, this is a very, very long spectrum. We shouldn't bunch them all in as the same thing. They're not the same thing.
Absolutely, they're not the same thing. So let's break it down. There's a piece of legislation going through Parliament at the moment which covers police, crime, sentencing and courts. And there are things we can do. It is not right that this piece of legislation says that the maximum sentence for damaging a memorial is 10 years, the minimum sentence for rape is 5 years. That's not the right balance. So we want to change some of the laws around things like rape. But there are other things we need to do. You're right. In the courts, very small proportion of rape cases and sexual abuse cases get to court in part because of these huge delays, and we're suggesting today we need a fast track process for some of this. And then on your point about wolf whistling, which is, I think it's really important that we have this conversation properly, because it does speak to an issue that I think we can tackle. At the moment, if you compare it with litter, say, nobody wants littering, you can be fined on the spot by the police for dropping litter. If you're a serial offender, you can be fined up to several £1,000s for dropping litter. If you are a serial offender of fly tipping, you can go to prison for up to 5 years. Now, there's it's not the case that I drop a tissue on the floor and the police come and arrest me, but there's a spectrum there. And with a harassment law, which they've done in France, we need to look at this properly. They've done it in France. In the first year, there were 450 fines given. Obviously, the police are not always going to be there when these things happen, but it does say, look, we don't want you to drop litter and we don't want you to harass women. And it seems like maybe there's a balance there we can find.
Well, hopefully we'll talk about this with you in the future as well.